What would you say are the qualities of chalk in terms of, is it a hard rock, is it a soft rock? Yes? Well, it is a soft rock, but you're right, they used to have buildings made of blocks of chalk, but it's a soft rock. And there's an easy way to tell a soft rock, ever so easy. If you can scratch it with your fingernail, it's a soft rock, because fingernails aren't very hard, but they're harder than chalk. Chalk's one of the softest rocks there is. The only rock I can think of that's softer is called talc. Do you know talcum powder that people put on themselves sometimes after a shower? That's made from about the softest rock there is, but chalk is a very, very soft rock. And if you put, now you mentioned about water, if you put water on chalk, what happens to the water? Yeah.
It gets like a different colour and goes all like powdery.
Yeah, and what happens to the water? If I had a block of chalk with water on the top, what would happen to the water?
It would disintegrate into the water.
Into the rock, that's right, yeah. It would be absorbed into the rock. So chalk is what's called porous. It's absolutely useless if you want to keep water in it. Now, why might that be a problem if you've got thousands of sheep on the downs? Ask someone else, yeah, you. Drink, exactly. We all need to drink, don't we? We do, sheep do, horses do, all animals need to drink. And so they had to make ponds on the downs, because as I said earlier, look out there, they're not sheep, are they? They're cattle. Yeah, they're cattle over there. Can't see any sheep. If we'd been sitting here 100 years ago, we'd have seen thousands of sheep everywhere. The whole of the downs would be covered in sheep. So they had to make ponds. Now, if you look over there, you stand up if you can't see. This is one of the ponds that they made for the sheep. And you can see it's all dried up now. There's no water in there. So how do you think it worked? If chalk is porous and all the water goes through the chalk, what do you think they had to do to make sure that pond kept all the water in? Yeah.
Maybe like dig up the chalk and replace it with something else?
Exactly, that's exactly it. They had to get clay. I expect some of you have used clay at school or at home to make things with, and clay is non-porous. You get a piece of clay and you put water on it, the water stays on the top, it doesn't sink in. So they had to cover the chalk with clay, and then they puddled it in, that's what they called it, where they would just stamp their feet up and down on the clay, and then they'd let the rainwater fill it up. But there was a problem though with these ponds, and the problem came in the summer. So you imagine it's like this every day for 3 or 4 weeks. What's going to happen to the water? Yeah.
It's going to evaporate.
It's going to evaporate. And then what will happen to the clay? Yeah. Yeah, go on.
It'll dry up.
It'll dry up. And if clay dries up, what happens to it? Someone else, yes. Yeah, and cracks. It becomes solid and cracks, and all the water goes through it. So they had to maintain them really regularly, particularly in the summer, where they'd have to come and put more clay on. So it was a lot of hard work for the shepherds and for the men who worked with them, just keeping these ponds full of water. Because if the water went, the sheep didn't have anything to drink, they'd die, and there were thousands of them. Now this one's all dried up, but sometimes if you're out with your family or friends, you will find some of these ponds that have been kept maintained, and they've still got water in. There's one up on Cissbury Ring, is the hill right on the horizon there with the trees on the top, and just to the left there's a pond that still is maintained and has water in, and they're called dew ponds.
Oh, yeah.
But it wasn't really dew that filled them up, it was rain. We're going to head up the hill. It's quite steep, so the first bit's quite steep, and then there are steps. So watch yourselves. Fortunately it's dry, so it won't be slippery, but you've still got to be careful on chalk when you're walking. And then when we get to the top, we'll stop and I'll say a few more things. Okay?
Just to let you know, any more questions about science, Mrs. Pollard.
Actually, does anyone know what chalk is made of? What it was originally? Yes? Sort of.
It's not what the cliffs at wherever,
Seven Sisters, Dover, Hare, all the chalk.
Is it the bones of the sea creatures?
Exactly, that's what it is.
See, I learned it. We went to Seven Sisters, what it was called. I learned it for about 6 months and then forgot.
Oh, you remembered now.
Crazy, yeah. But there was a word begins to see what they're actually called. I can't remember.
Well, they're calcitic. It's calcium. So you drink milk to help your teeth. Calcium helps build up your teeth and your bones. And so it's hard to imagine, but over millions of years, not thousands, over millions of years, in the sea, you had sea creatures, and as they died, their bodies fell to the bottom of the sea, the flesh all rotted away, but the bones built up on top of each other. Millions and millions of years of bones. And the pressure and weight of the bones on top of each other turned them into chalk. So I'm talking about thousands of years, which is still quite a long time. Now, if you look around, as I said at the path, you see where the earth has been built up. And that was the rampart of the hill fort, and below it is a ditch. So in about 2,200 years ago, the people living here then decided to fortify the whole of this hill, and it's a huge hill, and this is the second biggest hill fort in the whole of Britain, so it's really, really big. So it must have been really important to the people who built it. Now, why do you think people would build a fort? For? Defending their area. Against whom? Well, it wasn't the Normans then, but yeah, other tribes. So 2,200 years ago, there were lots of tribes in Britain. Britain wasn't a country like it is today. England wasn't a country like it is today. Those names didn't even exist. The people who lived here spoke a completely different language to us, and they called their land a completely different name to what we'd call it. And obviously, this was very important. This fort may have been an area where if there was danger and if there was war, all the people living around here would come here for safety, and they'd stay here within the earthwork, within the great wooden fence that was all the way round. Of course, the woods rotted away years and years ago. You can't see the wood anymore, and they would have felt safe here. Now, someone asked me yesterday, was there ever a battle here? And there's no evidence there was ever a battle here. But they did find a pit, and the pit was full of very round stones. They were all very round, but they hadn't been used. The pit had just been filled in with stones, and they may have been used, the purpose of those stones may have been as catapults. You all know what catapults are, slingshots? So that might have been the way they defended themselves. If people attacked, they'd stand over on top of the fence and fire these stones down at the people who were attacking. But the fact that stones all were in the pit suggests they were never needed. They were never needed. So this is very important, and the only other hill fort that's bigger than this is Maiden Castle in Dorchester, and that was in the Iron Age, called the Iron Age because that was the time when they invented iron and they started making tools and weapons of iron. So this is the oldest part of Cissbury in terms of archaeology. And does everyone know what archaeology is? Basically, an archaeologist is someone who studies history before there was writing. That's the way I'd sum it up. Archaeology, because the people who created the hill fort, and the people who created these that I'm going to tell you about in a moment, had no writing. So we can't look back at their books or their letters because there aren't any. So all we can find is the stuff they left behind, the things they made. And that really is archaeology. Discovering objects from the past and trying to explain them and what they meant to the people who lived then. So I said the downs are chalk, they are chalk, nearly all chalk, but you never get a chalk hill or a chalk cliff that doesn't have this in it. You know what this is? Flint. And this is really strange. It's a sort of bit of a paradox, really, that one of the softest rocks in the world, chalk, has within it one of the hardest rocks in the world, flint. Flint is really hard. So, you know, I said you can scratch chalk with your fingernail. Well, you can scratch iron with flint. Flint is harder than iron. It's really, really, really hard. So how did flint end up being in chalk? Well, the answer seems to be back to those animals again. So most of the animals that survived, what survived of the animals rather, was the bones that became the chalk. But also, even within all animals, including ourselves, we've got things that are made of silica or silica based, including, I believe, our hair and our fingernails. And so some of that survived, and that was formed into flint. That's how I understand. I'm not a geologist, so that's just how best I understand how it's been explained to me. But it is curious that you get this really, really hard rock in a really, really soft rock. So having said that, can anyone guess what that and all these other dips that you see all around that are now full of bushes and trees, what were they? Someone who has... Yes.
Flint mines.
Flint mines, well done. They're flint mines. So they're all filled in now, but originally they would have been up to 40 foot deep. So what's that in meters? That's 8 meters?
Yeah, about 12, 13.
Meters, yeah.
About 3 foot.
So deep enough that if you fell into it, you'd do yourself a lot of harm. But here's a strange thing. Why did they, and these were people living 6,000 years ago, and the tools they had were basically antlers, from deer. So they were using those to dig into the chalk. Can you imagine how long that would take to dig 15 meters down into chalk using a deer antler? Why do you think they dug into the chalk to look for flint? Right? Why didn't they just pick it up from the surface? Any ideas? Yeah.
Maybe because the flint on the surface would have been smaller pieces and down there they would have been much larger?
That is half the answer, definitely. They would have been, the bits on the surface are small like this. Yes?
They might have been cracked a bit more?
They've been cracked a bit more. And the reason they've been cracked a bit more is that although flint is very hard, it's also fragile. So, you could scratch away at that and not make any impression. But if you hit a flint in a certain way, it cracks. And once flint has been on the ground during a hot summer and then during a cold winter, it becomes more fragile. So it's easier to break when it's been exposed to the air. They were digging down deep into the chalk to find the flint that hadn't been exposed to the air, which, as you said, was bigger. In fact, it was seams of flint. If you go to a chalk cliff or any cliff facing the sea made of chalk, you think it's all white. But when you get closer to it, you see there are bands of black running all the way through it. And they are seams of flint, about 10 centimetres to 15 centimetres thick. And that's what they were after. And sometimes people call it tabular flint because it's thick. It's like a tabletop. And that's what they were looking for. And what do you think they used? Why did they want flint? What were they going to do with it? Someone else. Any idea what they might do with flint? Yes?
Are they going to use it like their catapult?
They could have used, although they could have used the ones on the ground for that, but particular use. Yes. Weapons, and what's the other thing? Tools, weapons and tools, exactly what they would use them for. I've got a friend whose job used to be working for the National Trust. You remember I said the National Trust look after Cissbury Ring? And his name's Glyn Jones, and he was, for about 20 years, he was the National Trust ranger here on Cissbury and other places in the Downs as well. And in all the years that he worked here, he picked up a lot of these flint tools because you can find them as you walk around. And so he's lent them to me, which is very kind of him. So here you are. These are flint tools, and these are 6,000 years old, which is amazing, isn't it? And they're just more or less as they were made all those years ago. Now, he also has, which he's lent me, this. Now, what's the obvious striking difference between this and these two? Yes? Different colour. And it's the colour that will tell you whether the flint tool is old or new. This was made 6 years ago, these were made 6,000 years ago. And this was made by someone who spent years and years trying to work out how the Stone Age people who lived here and dug the flint mines, how they made these. And it's called knapping. It's a strange name. The chipping off of flint to make a tool is called knapping. And there's still some knappers around today, but they usually make walls. You often see walls or even houses made of flint. And when you look at the wall of the house, sometimes it's a flint stone, but sometimes it's been cut in half so the black shows. And that's called knapping, and it's a real skill. Yeah.
Like in the past, I found like flint tools like that, and they have like almost imprints for like thumbs and fingers.
Yeah.
How would they like do that?
Well, just by their skill. They learned that if you hit a flint in a certain way, they know what sort of bit will fall off. It's just practice, practice, practice over years and years. And because that's all they did, they would have been brilliant at it. They would have been so skilled. And no one today could be that skilled, and certainly couldn't make them as quickly as they made them. Yes, so you're absolutely right. The white ones are the old ones, and if you see one like that, then it's not old. Why? Any idea why these turn white? Yeah.
Because they've been in the mud and soil. Maybe.
Yeah, the mud and soil is part of it. Yeah.
Is it like?
But once it's out of the ground and in the air, a process happens whereby all the chalk within the flint comes to the surface, and chalk starts to form around it. And this is called the rind. You know, you have a rind of an orange. So they call this the rind of the flint. So the longer that's outside in the air, the whiter it becomes. And just to explain how they did the mining, they dug down until they found the seam of flint, and it could be up to 15 metres down. And when they found the seam of flint, what you've got to imagine, if you imagine a bicycle wheel, you've got the hub in the middle, and then you've got the spokes coming off, haven't you? The spokes of a bicycle wheel. So when they got to the bottom, they dug in all different directions, following the seams of flint. And you can imagine what hard work that would have been. It would have been hot, it would have been dangerous, and they found 2 remains of skeletons. In fact, one of the first archaeologists in Britain was a man called General Pitt Rivers, and he came here in 1867, a long time ago, with his friend Mr. Harrison and another friend, and they were the first people in thousands of years to dig down there and work out what these pits were for, because people saw these pits, but they thought, oh, maybe people lived in them, or maybe they stored food in them. No one knew what they were for, and it was General Pitt Rivers who discovered and explained that they were flint mines. And in his book that he wrote when he was an old man, looking back on his life, he described being down there and excavating, and how his friend Mr. Harrison was standing on the top like I am now, while he was down the bottom of a ladder digging. And he wrote, "Presently a well-formed and perfect human jaw fell down from above, and looking up I could perceive the remainder of the skull fixed with the base downward and the face towards the west between 2 pieces of the chalk rubble. When I saw this, I hollered out so loudly that Mr. Harrison, who happened to be outside at the time, although he had been himself previously assisting in the excavation of this gallery, thought it must have tumbled in and came with a shovel to dig me out. It was some time before I could make him understand that we had added a 3rd person to our party." So that would have been a shock, wouldn't it? Down the bottom there, digging away, and suddenly this skull falls down in front of you. And that was the remains of one of the flint miners. And another skeleton was found elsewhere. And I mean, this shows how clever archaeology is. They can work out from the bones whether it was a man or a woman. And this was a woman, and so were the other remains. So it could be that mining was something that women did. It was women's work, which could be because generally women are smaller than men, and they would have been really tight galleries, small tight tunnels. So the smaller you were, the better you were to be a flint miner, and perhaps even children. So maybe people your age would have been sent down there to dig out the flint. And there's so many of them. If you come back another time with your friends or family, walk around here and you'll just see I'm not sure if there's hundreds, but there's certainly dozens of them. So if we had X-ray eyes and we could look into this hill, we'd see there were tunnels, galleries in all directions where they were following the digging up of the flint. So there's a connection between Cissbury and the Spanish Armada.
Cool, there you go. Note this.
No.
For your work.
Cissbury and Spanish Armada. So during the reign of Queen Elizabeth, Spain was the big superpower in the world, like America is now. Very powerful, big army, big navy, and Spain and England got into a quarrel between Queen Elizabeth of England and King Philip of Spain, and so he tried to invade England, tried to get rid of Queen Elizabeth, and he was going to do it by a big invasion. Hundreds of huge Spanish boats called galleons were all assembled, and the English knew they were coming, but they didn't know when they'd be coming. So they needed to warn everybody that the invasion was happening. Now, back in those days, in the days of Queen Elizabeth in 1588, obviously they didn't have any of our modern technology. They didn't have telephones, they didn't have telegraphs. So they had to think of a really quick way to let everyone in the south of England know that the invasion was happening. And the way they did it was through the lighting of beacons. And a beacon is basically a huge bonfire. So they would have built a massive bonfire here of sticks and wood, huge, probably really much taller than me, a massive great bonfire. And they would have built bonfires on all the hills between here and Cornwall at about every 20 miles. Wherever there was a high hill, they built a big bonfire that they called a beacon. And when the Spanish Armada was seen coming up the channel off Devon, the person who saw it lit the beacon, and then 20 miles along, the people there, the beacon's lit, we'll light ours. And so each hill seen the beacon before them being lit theirs. So actually, in a very quick time, the whole of the south of England knew the Spanish were coming. And so English boats went out to fight them. It wasn't really the English sailors that beat the Spanish Armada, it was the weather. It was an amazing storm, because usually you get storms in the winter, but this was the storm in July, in the middle of summer, and it raged, I think, for 5 days. Huge seas, massive winds, pouring rain, and that sank a lot of the boats. And after the Armada was defeated, a special coin was minted, and on one side of the coin was a picture of Queen Elizabeth, and on the other side was a picture of Spanish galleons sinking, and at the top it said, "God blew and they were scattered." So it was a very great victory, but the beacons were very important for letting everyone know that the danger was coming. Right, we've got one more last stop before I finish, and it's all downhill from now, you'll be pleased to know.
Right, Lucy and Huxley, I hope that's...
Now, you see, it's very confusing, because you could look at that and think, oh, that was a flint mine. But it wasn't. That was the result of a bomb that dropped from a German plane in the 1940s in the Second World War. And when the German bombers were going over to London, dropping their bombs on London, sometimes they didn't drop all of them, they had some left. But if they went back to Germany still with bombs, they'd get into trouble. Why didn't you drop all your bombs? So they just dropped them anywhere. And that was a bomb that dropped. So that isn't ancient, not in archaeological terms, that's from the 1940s. Fortunately, no one was standing around when the bomb dropped.
If we go to...
It's always hard to remember all of it. Right, our final stop down here. While we've been walking around, I've been looking on the ground, because June is the time of year when you can find wild strawberries on Cissbury. So you know the strawberries you buy in the supermarket are about that big, aren't they? But wild strawberries are tiny, really, really small. But they're so sweet. Even though they're small, they're much sweeter than the big strawberries. And you can find them on Cissbury during June, but you've really got to get down and look. And you have obviously not just going out of the grass, you have to find the little strawberry bushes with the green feathery leaves. So if you come up here in the next couple of weeks, family or friends, usually on the other side actually, the side of Cissbury that faces the sun the most, that's where you find the wild strawberries, and they are delicious, but they're very, very small. It's peaceful here today, apart from when we had the helicopter, and maybe I might get another one. And there's a tractor in the field there, you can hear that, but really it's quite peaceful. But in the 1980s, and a lot of your parents might remember this, there was a plan to build a huge road right across here, right where the car park is, right south of the trees, right through the southern part of Findon Parish. You all know the A27, don't you? The A27, yeah. Oh, you definitely know it. So the A27 that takes you to Brighton or takes you to Chichester, really big, busy road, and it's been very controversial about how to manage the traffic. And in the 1980s, there was a plan to build the road through here and through the Downs. Well, if they built the road, you probably wouldn't even be able to hear me now. The noise would be so great. And some people said that mustn't happen. We've got to keep this landscape as it is, keep it quiet, keep it for future generations. And one man who did more than anybody else to stop that happening was Captain Bill Yeager, who I knew very well. And that bench you're sitting on was put there in his memory. And on the back of the bench, before you leave, don't look now, but before you leave, you can read, there's a little plaque that says about him, and that it was put there in his memory for all his efforts in trying to preserve this very important and ancient landscape. So that's a brief tour, introduction to Cissbury Ring. Are there any questions that anybody's got that I haven't talked about already? Anything you want to ask me? Well, thank you for being very attentive. I hope you've learned something, and I hope you found it interesting. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you. Say thank you.
Pleasure.
Right, so